wants to paint their house bright pink. In Cambridge, well, we do allow them to do bright yellows and purples, but I've never seen anything in bright pink yet. Should this, and you think about association, here it's government association, should there be some is it ever correct, ever right, ever appropriate for a community to set some standards of what they consider to be in good taste?
I believe, I guess this is, there's a theoretical argument and then there's the practical one. Let me give you the practical one because we live in this world. The practical one is that if you bought a house in a historic district and you reap the benefits of the historic district in the sense of having a higher value home because you bought in the historic district, yeah, I think you gotta abide by some rules. You bought into it. You've made that decision as an individual. I frankly don't have any problem with pink houses. I live in Brookline, and a similar thing happened to me where I had to get, I had to fix my front, and they made me put specific plants in a planter, and they made a determination as to what they would be. I'm not kidding. I didn't appreciate that. It made everything much longer in terms of regulatory process. It made it more expensive for me. That's a regulatory taking from my perspective. I really don't care if someone across the street has a pink house, and I don't live in a historic district. So I have a right to complain. I feel your house is nicer as a historic district, so don't complain.
Great. Who you are, what you do.
My name is Martin Evans. I'm a former professor. I'm a former Brit. I'm a former Canadian. And I enjoy the benefits of both the British and Canadian healthcare systems. But I'd like to react to this comment. I think there is a dimension missing from our discussion, and that is knowledge. That there's no way that I can tell what kind of healthcare treatment I need. There's no way I can assess the quality of a doctor, the quality of a hospital. And without that knowledge, I can't enter a market. Markets depend on knowledge. How do you react?
Is that for me? Dr. Evans, is that towards me? Do you want me to, is it for me or is it for
both? Anyone?
I agree with you. I think one of the things that we absolutely need to do in order to have, let me step back for a second, history. I think history is always important in economics. There is no blanket theory that works. You have to understand where you came from. We came from a place where there were public charities that provided health care that were largely run, of course, by people who had stature in their community, who wanted to make sure their employees and their fellow citizens had health care. That was a different world. It changed an awful lot to the point where we have systems in place. We have great government involvement. And I believe the only way to peel back government involvement, which I do believe should happen, is to have much better knowledge. That means data on procedures, which procedures are actually working better, data also on which doctors are doing better and which ones are not, correcting for adverse selection and all the rest. I do believe that the law of 2006 should have put us on a pathway to do much more of that. I have to say that I'm very disappointed with this administration for not doing that. I think we have not done anything on the transparency of pricing or clinical outcomes near to what we had to do in order to contain costs, which however much people want to say, was not part of the 2006 law, was certainly part of the law. So I agree with you, and currently with the system that we have, which is a great mix of government and private providers, I do think we have to have greater knowledge before we can peel back more of that and give more of that to market forces. I would say this, just a quick thing for all of us to look at. There's a very interesting experiment happening in Massachusetts now, which is the Steward Network. We have a private provider that has come in and bought up very quickly a number of institutions. No judgment on whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. They are pitching themselves as being able to provide high quality care at a lower rate because there's such bloat in the system. And I would note this, that they're right, because there are many hospitals that have 4 or even 5 times the cost of that same service that another hospital is providing. So I think there will be something of a change agent, though I don't know how much. And I do think that we, from the government perspective, through the connector, and many other efforts, have to ramp up transparency before we can actually go back to people and say, yeah, you should choose your own health care. I think we need more work there.
It's interesting, a preview of coming attractions. Next week when I present Milton Friedman, I'm going to go through the 8 fundamental assumptions in the Friedman model. And 3 of them are what I call the perfection assumptions. First one's perfect competition. There's no monopolies, no one can set prices, everybody's competing like crazy. The second one is perfect mobility. Labor, capital can move. It's not trapped anywhere. But the third is perfect information. And that for both firms and individuals to make rational decisions, they have to have perfect information. They have to know about information about prices, quality, and so forth. The real question is who should supply that information? The market supplies some of it. You don't always trust the advertising on TV when private sector does it, or the pharmaceutical industry. But for a long time, we thought this should be done by the federal government or state governments, FDA, SEC, all of these to create more information. One argument that people are making today is we now have so many sources of information, given the internet and given the way we distribute information, that in fact much of this can be done privately. And the real question is how much of the information, for instance, about the quality of doctors, the quality of care, the cost effectiveness of that care, how much of that should be a government agency role, and how much can be done by other means?
Two comments. Jim.
Who are you? And what
Oh,
do you
I'm
do?
sorry. My name's Russ Eckel. I'm a sociologist. Just a comment, and it's also a comment / concern. In the graphs you showed with respect to the centralization of federal, if you will, almost federal spending or federal entitlements, if you will, and you showed it over a fairly long period of time, and you used total federal spending. Just as an observation, it appears to me that, it would seem to me anyway, that at least since 1945, the United States government and the United States taxpayer assumed a role in the world that was not assumed by Japan, Italy, France, Great Britain, New Zealand, or any of the other countries, and that was the protection of Asia, the protection of Europe, and in the last decade, seemingly the protection of every oil pipeline in the world. And so I find those graphs somewhat, frankly, disingenuous to the extent to which they imply a broader social intervention vis-a-vis federal spending. Second comment, I was intrigued by your... Sure.
The percentage of spending on the military from the federal government, the overall federal budget, was something on the order of 12% in 1960. It's currently 3.5%. So I don't think it's disingenuous.
Can't hear him.
Well, to discard the costs associated with defending, quote unquote, the free world for the last 65 years.
I don't disagree with you.
Okay, well, if we compared defense spending in those other countries to the United States, I think the relationship would change.
But
My other comment, though,
just to go back at this for a second, I'm not trying to be,
right.
petty. The thing that you have to I think all of us have to recognize is that by the same token, we have an employer/government-based healthcare system where we still spend probably, I spend $13,000 a year, my employer spends $13,000 a year purchasing healthcare. Japan, for whatever size of government it has, the healthcare is already included. So the size of our government, if you will, if you do it on an apples-to-apples basis, it's even bigger. We're not getting great value, folks, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, well, that, again, it was a comment concern. It seemed to me that, in my mind anyway, that was one issue. But the other comment I had, I was intrigued by your argument very early on that I actually find quite appealing in some ways, that rights are not just about the defense of the individual against the intrusion of kind of an unjust state, but rather the right of some type of real free, as a human being, right of association with others. And it seems to me that's expressed to a very large extent in a lot of our corporate law, which allows investors and other people to get together, own property, and then behave and act as a collective, but through the right of free association. Where that seems to me not to be as much the case, and I'm just curious what your opinion is when employees exercise that same right of free association to form a trade union, and then that is called an unfair restraint of trade. It seems to me that the right of acting as a member of a property class, an investor, is equal to the right of association vis-a-vis free trade unions. And yet it would appear, at least particularly in this moment in time, that many conservatives and libertarians are seriously calling into question whether the right of free association, as you've defined it, to act collectively in the workplace in the form of representation through a trade union, that seems to be a right that is seriously being challenged. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Dr. Sackle, on that, I say you're absolutely right. I think that labor individuals have the right to associate in any manner that they see fit. I think if there are conservatives who do that, I'm not going to defend them. What I would say is that in the public sector, it's a much more complicated situation. The right to collectively bargain and to associate as a government employee really stems from the early 60s. And I would say that's a little bit of a different animal. But if you're saying to me, were the Verizon folks right to do what they did, or of course, they can do whatever they want. They're free individuals. I like freedom.
And Jim, go a little step further. What's the, I think I know the answer, but what's the difference in the public sector? Why do you distinguish between the Verizon workers and, let's say, the Boston Teachers Union?
Because of the fact that several reasons. One is that these are people who are working for us ultimately, and therefore that they're, if, for example, there is a law that says that teachers cannot go out on strike, right? They have fewer rights. We've recognized that through time. They're part of public service that we consider to be essential, and therefore they should not have the very same rights. I do also think there's that issue of capture, which is huge, and I think has played out in the way that I described, in the sense that there are the relationship between unions and political agents is clear. 17 of the top 20 PACs in Massachusetts are public unions. So I think from those two perspectives, I would say that we've never recognized it to be on the same plane, but in private industry, absolutely. They should have every right to associate as they see fit.
My name is Luke Hill. I live here in Boston, and thank you both for incredibly thought-provoking presentations. And I wanted to kind of take advantage of the Tokevillian activity of the Occupy folks, who I'm a big fan of Tocqueville as well, and love your point about the Bill of Rights protecting fundamentally voluntary associations. It seems to me that's one of the things that's happening. It's exciting. Stergios, you said at one point something like, markets can't establish a level playing field, which just kind of struck a bell with me, and I'd like for both of you just to say more about that, why you said that, and how level playing fields can be established, and maybe take advantage of the Occupy movement and the focus on Wall Street and the financial industry, and kind of use that as your example to illustrate your thoughts.
Okay. Luke, thank you for the question. I appreciate the comments. And it's Jim all the time. There are several reasons why I said it. One is that there has been a recognition from day one the smooth working of labor markets. Labor and capital requires guardrails. That you have to have there has to be some definition of what the rules of the game are. Right? And I mean that in several ways. And I highlighted a couple of them. I would underscore them again. One is property rights. When you talk about property rights, well, I like property rights, but I also recognize that for the smooth working of the market, there is a place for bankruptcy law, right? And that's socializing failure. Copyright law. There's all kinds of debate about what's the right term for copyrights. Look, if you give someone a copyright for 30 years, that in a way is socially unbeneficial. They get a great benefit from the fact that no one can copy it for a while. Those are certainly defined by government and need to be defined by government. I would say one thing further, which I think is of the times, and that is transparency. Whether we're talking about some of the more complicated financial instruments that were developed over time, having an understanding of what was even out there. I think one of the greatest challenges we faced as a country in the days when we were facing essentially a liquidity crisis was that no one had any idea the size of what they were facing. I think everyone needs, any investor needs to have that sort of thing. I also would say there are certain instruments of investment that were pretty akin to gambling. And I think that the government has a role to determine what is gambling, what's not gambling, right? I mean, when you start betting on people going down, and there are certain kinds of instruments where you can actually promote that. I don't know. That doesn't do anyone any real benefit. And even look, short sales, right? Short sales have been here since the market have existed. And they play a really important role. Okay, but there has to be some definition of what that is, right? Insider trading. We want to allow that or not? People allowed it for the longest time. We determined at a certain point there was a certain technological development within our markets. We couldn't sustain it anymore. It was an avalanche. At some point, I think people are going to talk about the computerization of buying and selling, how fast it is. That they may want to say, I don't know if we're creating more crises than we want. What we want out of our financial sector, I'm spending too much on the financial sector, it's of the day. What we want of our financial sector is we want Steve Jobs. We want a brilliant young guy in a garage who finds some guys in suits who walk in and say, we'll give you $100 million. And you can go change the world. That's what we want, right? So, I mean, regulatory barriers, guardrails to make sure we're maximizing that benefit, I think are yeah. The same thing around labor.
Let's see if I can put a final point on this, because, and let's stay with financial markets. So we have a banking crisis in 1929, 1930. The government passes a law to try and regulate banking called Glass-Steagall, which separates normal commercial banking from other kinds of financial transactions. And that seems to keep a fairly stable banking system for a number of decades. And under the Clinton administration, not under Reagan, not under Bush, one or two, we repeal Glass-Steagall. And there are many economists and many financial advisors who would suggest that that was a very bad idea. That eliminating that line between banks that can do a great deal of speculation and can invest in fairly risky investments from normal commercial banks was a mistake. And what it did is it pushed a lot of banks who would normally be very conservative for competitive reasons, into very highly speculative investments, including all kinds of subprime mortgages that got put into all kinds of new financial instruments. So let me ask this question, maybe to Jim. Do you think it was appropriate, in retrospect, to have repealed Glass-Steagall, or are those the kind of guardrails that you think were helpful?
I'm always of the view that I don't talk beyond what I know. And to be honest, I just don't know enough about the details of it. I know enough to be dangerous, but I don't want to make a pronouncement, because I know about as much as probably most people in the room. I would say this, and this is on sort of, in the interest of being, showing sympathy for the fact that you had to call one out on Clinton, let me call one out on Reagan. When you go back to the idea of too big to fail, right? Just talking about how we set the playing field, right? How we define what expectations are. Continental Bank was going to go down in 1983, 1984. We were coming out of a recession. And there was a risk that Reagan said, well, we could go into another dip. I've got to save that bank. And from then, we've never looked back. Is that really what we want to do? And Continental was nearly as big as some of the fish we're actually dealing with more recently. And we've seen a concentration of banks and banking interests. Which, again, I don't know enough about to say whether this is awful, good, bad, whatever it is. The only thing that I you know, when you get to, well, I was talking about associations before, and how we need to let the government needs to allow for freedom of association, not displace associations. It also has this role of creating bad associations. And that is whether you're talking about numerous PACs that are developed over time, because they know where the goodies are hidden. They know who can define the playing field, and when the government takes a more expansive role, they go and they pay and they get it done. So, you know, the big banking interests, and I'm not trying to play class warfare, I'm not trying to, you know, I'm just talking honestly, you know, is it good to have Bank of America be so big? I don't know. I think we should talk about that.
Very good.
Hi, my name is Justin. I'm a graduate student here. My question is for Jim, and I would like to go back to what you said about states deciding to take on additional so-called quote-unquote rights and them making those decisions. Two quick questions about that. There's a provision in the healthcare law that hasn't gotten a lot of attention that I'm wondering what you think about. It kicks in 2017. The president has proposed advancing it to 2014. It says that if your state can cover as many people as the national law would have your state cover for the same cost or lower, so provided you achieve the same goals as the national law, you can basically do it however you want to. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. And more generally, I'm wondering what you think about if so many states, just generally as a principle, are setting up so many different regulatory schemes, what that says about competitive advantage and just businesses facing inconsistent rules.
Great question. What's your name?
Justin.
Justin, thank you for the question, Justin. Okay, on the provision of the law that you described, which I don't know the ins and outs of all the details, but I would say the general practice of having the federal government say, we'll give it back to you states, but we expect you to meet certain goals, I have always been for. I'll give you one example that's outside the healthcare realm, just to kind of make the point. Transportation dollars flow into Massachusetts, like to all other states, and they subsidize largely new projects. We are an older state with older infrastructure. We don't benefit from that in the same way, except for what we did during the Big Dig. We don't benefit from that in the same way, and we would certainly do much better. I think the governor's done a great job with the Deficient Bridges program, which we helped develop that program and pioneer. We are great believers in that. Because we realized if we invested now, we would avoid future costs of fixing bridges that were probably in F condition rather than C or D. But if we were able to access federal dollars on a sort of on a more regular basis for maintenance, that would do a lot for this state. That's not true of Colorado. They're still building. Texas is still building. Texas is building huge highways and doing the tolls and everything they can do because they want to grow so fast, right? So if the federal government and transportation would say, we want your congestion numbers to meet this, and we want your environmental numbers to meet this, I'm a great believer in state government to get stuff done. I think there are great people in state government. I think that it's close to us. You know, we know what we need. Your second question, which was about if we have so many different state regimes, more or less defining what the play space is for healthcare, is that a competitive disadvantage? My view on that is we've lived with that for a long time. Companies are used to that. And I believe in experimentation because unlike education where I believe we know what works, in healthcare, honestly, we don't know yet. And I know the governor actually may disagree with that in terms of, I think he has some clear ideas about Hawaii. No, but I mean, we've talked about this before and he makes good points. But I believe in a modern era where people are making much more use of information at home, are going to be receiving care at home, where there are all these companies out there that are going to be serving people in their homes. This is an animal that's changing before our eyes, and I want to see experiments all over the place.
Hi, my name is Erica Gerstenberger. I'm a master's student in law and public policy program here at Northeastern. My question is for Mr. Stergios. You discussed the importance of the right of association, and Professor Bluestone expressed his opinions on corporate free speech. I was waiting for somebody to ask you your thoughts on Citizens United and if you view this as a conflict.
All right, you're getting me now, aren't you? I do have a different view from Barry on that, but I guess my view is pretty simple. I believe in freedom of association across the board, but I guess one place where I have a little more trouble with it is I believe that individuals, because individuals vote, should be able to give money, but I don't believe in associations, whether corporate or union or whatever, should give money. I believe that the amount of money that people give should be higher. These $500 stuff at the state level is silly for someone who, how do you actually break out of the box if you don't have a known name? But I believe there should be some level of limit that makes sure that there isn't one person who writes the check. So in that case, I believe, given that the function of a voter is individual, I believe that the giving should be individual.
Can I clarify that? That sounded to me like you disagreed with the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United, am I correct?
I guess I would agree with part of it, and I disagree with part of it. I think if we are opening up the floodgates all over the place, I'm happy to have corporate money in there as well. That's all I'm saying. So, sorry about that, guys. I'd rather not have it.
Hi, my name is Joan Rooney. I am a manager of an online tutoring company. And I'd like to go back to a statement that I think both of you made, which is that that we need to have a foundation of trust. But we don't have a foundation of trust. And every time there's a violation of the public trust, government, either in anticipation of that violation or in response to that violation, responds by regulating. And there's a need to regulate. There's a need to regulate because companies pollute the environment, and the public has to pay for that with taxes to clean it up. Or companies violate the public trust because they don't protect our food supply. There are so many instances, the one you just mentioned yourself, in which the financial industry ran amok selling things that they didn't even understand what they were, and we had to bail them out. So in all of these cases, there are violations of the public trust, and that engenders regulation. And so what I don't understand is, how do we establish a public trust again, and therefore not need this level of regulation?
It's a great question. I guess I'll give my quick take, and I would say this, that you're absolutely right that I think there have been violations of the public trust. I would also note there have been violations of the public trust in government as well. I think here in the state we've seen plenty of it. I would also note that there have been violations of the public trust with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, though I'm not saying they're at the root of all evil. They're not the ones who caused everything and all this, but this is shared responsibility in terms of what they had to do, the kinds of lobbying they were doing around their own reporting, and all the rest. This was a train wreck on everybody's part. So I would say the first thing is, it's not just companies, it's government as well. One of the reasons why I'd like to separate them more is that I've never been a great believer in all kinds of incentives for government, for companies coming out of government, because I believe there could be contamination. And I think what you've heard repeatedly from me is, I think that's important. It's really kind of important to separate those out as much as possible. I would also note that when we regulate, we often do it with a sort of, my pants are on fire kind of mentality. Enron happens, right? Bad outcome, right? And what we do is we create Sarbanes-Oxley. I now, with a small not-for-profit, $1.5 million a year, not a huge thing, relatively small, I have something on the order of 65 pages of reports that I have to provide to the federal government that no one will ever look at. All right, and that's true of so many people now. And has it prevented anything? I haven't heard of one thing that it's prevented. Did it create any more public trust before this latest onslaught of distrust that's developed? Not really. So I guess my view is to separate government and the public sector in terms of incentives and interplay, so we don't all create these tax incentives for specific businesses, and we don't create this, again, something of a mess of a tax code, that we kind of separate out what are responsibilities of each individual. But I do believe on the other side there should be transparency. The way forward, I think, in the financial services specifically is a lot more transparency. But again, I want useful transparency. I think there's a lot in the Dodd-Frank Act. It's not terribly useful. There are some things that are useful. When a bank gets to be huge, to have more capital holdings, amen, right? So, I mean, I honestly think we need to be a little more grown up about this. I don't mean to be kind of facetious in that way, but transparency is really good, separating out government and what's government, what is unto Caesar is Caesar's, and what is the private sector is unto the private sector. I'm a great believer in that.
Let me just add a little to that, because I think that this is in one of actually many places where Jim and I agree, even though we may have some disagreements on other things. I am actually a big believer in what Governor Patrick is doing now, which is calling for a review of all regulations across all agencies, trying to find out where there is effective regulation and where regulations no longer are doing their job. I think we have a problem in the country of doing two things. One, we overreact. That is, we see a problem, and then what we say is we have to have a fix to that problem, and then we overreact, and there are a lot of unintended consequences that occur as a result. For that reason, I'm a strong believer in constantly looking at regulations, trying to find out whether they're too weak, but also trying to find out whether they're too strong and being implemented in ways that were not intended. Because you also have not only the question of whether you have a regulation that makes sense, but you're going to have a regulation that makes a lot of sense, but it's not implemented in a way that helps. And I think one of the problems we have, because of this lack of trust, and because we worry that people will cheat, is that we create all kinds of tremendous difficulties for us. We had people who cheated terribly on the construction of UMass Boston. Some of them went to jail. We then created laws that make it incredibly expensive and incredibly difficult to do public construction. That doesn't make any sense. It costs us more. What we should have is real penalties for people who cheat, and agree that we will, for the most part, trust people not to cheat. But if they do cheat, the penalty is going to be very strong. I've been opposed, for example, I don't think any of you heard me say this, I'm opposed to throwing people in jail for their economic indiscretions, like Madoff. I don't think he should go to jail, because what it means is all of us are paying for him to be in jail. What I do think should happen is people who do such things should be forced to live on $22,000 a year for the rest of their life, and have 100% tax on everything else, including any gift anybody gives them. That would be a penalty. That would be a penalty. And that might get people to do the right thing rather than cheat.
I don't know if he would have lived outside of jail at all.
Hi, my name is David Damming. Among other things, I teach economics at UMass. And so I had a question about this rights versus market goods issue. And isn't it possible that there are some goods that should be considered rights? However, we should allocate them using a market mechanism rather than the state, and just ensure that the citizenry has the income to purchase those goods through some mechanism, income transfers or whatever. In other words, is something that is a right necessarily have to be allocated to the state?
Well, let me give part of an answer, which would probably be Jim's answer, because it comes directly out of Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, you think of being somebody who just believes in markets alone. He actually believed in the negative income tax, that in fact that there should be, that people should be guaranteed a minimum amount of income, and they should be able to purchase those things they want, rather than have government determine what they need or what they should have. And so he actually believed in a negative income tax, which would say if your income was low enough, you actually got a subsidy from the government that would allow you to survive. His might be lower than what I'd like to see, but that was exactly Milton Friedman's principle.
And I agree with that principle. I would say this, I agree with you completely. One of the points I was trying to make before David was that when you think about something like education, which I think is critical to a free society and a market society, you can either redistribute wealth after the fact, you can make sure all kids have access to a good education. Not that everyone's going to use it the right way, but you have to make sure they actually have access to a good education, which is not the case. And when it is a public good as defined by our Constitution, we are great believers in the idea of not only charter schools, but also if there's a way to create ways for inner city kids and kids who don't have access to a good education in rural areas as well, to have a choice. And so there is certainly a model for doing that. I would note that Jerry Grossman, who used to head up New England Medical Center, was a great believer in the idea of charter medicine. There was a way to create that same sort of mechanism in the healthcare sector because, as he put it, people in Massachusetts do believe it's a public good at this point. But let's not just do it the same way we're doing it, right? And to some extent, I think the accountable care organization is kind of a yearning for that a little bit, where you have a closed network, you can access into it. It's trying to get somewhere near that. But I think there's absolutely a model for that, and I think it can be applied pretty regularly.
Julia Geisman, I'm a learning and organizational development consultant. So I actually have a couple of comments and or questions. One is, Barry, to key off of what you were saying about a review process that the governor is doing. I think that, you know, to try to simplify this issue is kind of nuts, only because we live in an increasingly more complex world with many more complex issues. And that causes a question in my mind as to how does one deal with complexity? Because we cannot just say, well, back in the 1950s it was X, Y, Z. And now we're, you know, because yes, it was complex, but not as complex as it is today. So there's a question of what is the balance given the increasing complexity of the world? That's number one, in my question. And the other thing is, you know, the basic nature of human beings really create a lot of, you know, that's the thing that really causes change. And my experience is that people, when they are in a position of power, will not relinquish it. They're not particularly generous with it. And therefore, there are times that you have to legislate a change in generosity or in awareness. And so again, what is that balance? Such that we really do have equal rights for people to be able to attain a certain level of health and well-being.
I don't know how to answer your first question about complexity. Yes, the world has gotten more complex. Everything we have is more complex. My cell phone is more complex than the phone I had in 1950, and yet we have engineers and technicians who kind of know how to make them and fix them most of the time. What I think it calls for is much smarter government. I think it calls for much smarter and transparent government, as Jim says, so that we're constantly taking a look at what we do and asking the question, are we doing it the best way possible? And the things that I keep talking about when I do meet with government officials, let's say the Secretary for Administration and Finance, who's been pushing this very hard, Jay Gonzalez, is how do we make sure that every government service we have is providing that service effectively, that is, meeting the goals of that service, and efficiently, doing it at the lowest cost possible, consistent with meeting that goal. And I think what happens is we have a tendency to set things up and then leave them there. And that fails. It failed in the auto industry, that I know very well. They just left it there. They didn't respond to changes in a lot of things, including engineering. You know, keep saying Detroit was great. They invented the vinyl top to cars back in the 1950s, while other people were inventing fuel injection, you know, radial tires and disc brakes. On the second question, you asked about power. Is that I am somebody who is very much concerned about concentrated power. What you're going to hear in my lecture next week is somebody who's even more concerned about it, Ken Galbraith, who in looking at the 1950s saw, you know, just massive amounts of power in the corporate sector, massive amounts of power in trade unions, and even massive amount of power in consumers through large retailers, smaller than Walmart, but big for their time. And he suggested because of that massive power and the ability of that power to become unequal, you needed to have fairly big government as a counterweight against that. Now the real question is, have we gotten to a point because of international competition, have we gotten to a point because of new technology, that bigness can't last? That new inventions, take away the power of any one company. I've been following Akamai, which happens to be a company I know quite well, and they're under tremendous competition because there's new technologies that make it difficult for them to compete, and their stock is dropping as a result. Is it possible that new technologies and international competition make it very difficult for anybody to control for a long time great power? On the other hand, when we looked at the banking institutions, you saw banking institutions that seemed to be so mammoth that, quote unquote, we couldn't let them fail. So are there certain cases where you really do need government, almost in an 1890s trust vesting mode, which says we're not going to let such behemoths emerge? Or can technology and global competition eliminate that in all markets? I tend to think that there are a lot of markets where just market competition, global competition and technology limits growth in size, but that there are others where that doesn't happen, and too often, and I think Jim would agree with this, government sometimes supports the construction of those big mammoth entities, and we certainly don't want government doing that.
Julie, I appreciate the question. I guess my reaction is that in terms of a complex world, I agree that it is incredibly complex at this point. I do think we make it much more complex. I'll give you a couple of very specific examples. And my answer to you is we should regulate for outcomes. That's what I mean. When you're dealing with businesses and when you're dealing with zoning issues and that sort of thing, regulate for outcomes. I'll give you a couple of examples. It used to be that the EPA would regulate polluters, power plants, by saying you must use X technology. Technology was changing so fast, they changed it to the latest and best technology. And some of the smarter people in the EPA these days are moving to, we just want you to get to X. We don't care how you do it. All right? And I think that's a much easier way to get there. At a much more local level. If you're a builder and you have 10 acres and it's abutting a wetland, is it better to say you can be within 25 feet if you don't build X, Y, or Z, within 50 feet if you build A, B, or C, and if you add anything beyond 400 square feet to your house, you have to do, all these, is it better to do that or simply to say you can have this much impact on the wetland or no impact on the wetland and do what you want besides that? I mean, there are different ways of thinking that through. The way it currently works is we ratchet back the number of houses that can be built anywhere near a wetland. But we allow them pretty close. Is that smart? Would you rather have a developer bundle a number of units far further away from that wetland? If you give the developer a choice, say here clearly is what the outcome, this is the outcome we want. You do whatever you need to do to get there. I think it's a far smarter way of regulating. It's also easier to enforce. So that's the first point on complexity. The second one is on power. I guess my thought is this. Your question is, basic human nature says that people in power won't relinquish, and I absolutely agree with you. And you seem to ebb and flow between corporate power to government power, to corporate power to government power. My question is always, who guards the guardians? And what I mean by that is, my sense is that when government has power, the big companies are still there at the table, running the regulations, or at least having a huge impact on the regulations. They are going to be kept safe, right? And they're going to be able to build beyond where they are because they'll have helped write the regulations the way they want. There's no one to guard us from the government. That's what the Bill of Rights is about. And that's what the freedom of association is about. Talking to you guys tonight, talking amongst ourselves, talking out in the Greenway. All that, including the Tea Party. God bless them. Keep talking. It's great to talk about the public thing, to talk about what America is. Whoever it is, even if it aggravates you, it's good to do it. So I guess I don't see government as a counterweight to big business. It's never worked that way, I'm sorry. It really, the trust busters here for a while. But I don't see that as a pattern throughout history.
I think we have time for one more question. Professor Nathanson.
Steve Nathanson, professor of philosophy here at Preston. I want to pick up on the remark made earlier on trust. I think that was really an excellent point to raise. And it seems to me that there's so many examples mentioned of various kinds of companies and governments as well that are untrustworthy. And I'm just thinking about the talk last week about inequality. And it seems to me that whether it's human nature or not, if the stakes are high enough, if the incentives are powerful enough, people will cut corners and do dishonest things that are harmful to others so as to make more money. And the talk we heard last week suggested that a lot of the woes of societies come from inequalities. And I'm wondering, since I guess both of you convinced me that it's actually impossible to regulate effectively, it would take more regulators than we have businesses, right? So that strategy of monitoring and policing seems doomed to fail. That if we had a fairly severe limit, or some limit, on the upper amount that people would learn and own, then we would take away the incentive to do all of these dishonest things. And it wouldn't take as many regulators to actually enforce that. I mean, I'm philosophically a great believer in regulation, but I just think there's too many companies, there's not enough regulators, there's not enough hours in the day. And as long as the big money is there, people are going to keep at it, so maybe we just need to take the big money away.
I hope not, because I want to make the big money sometime. Look, I think there's a fundamental problem with the premise of the question, Steve. And I think the fundamental premise is that if you think people are motivated by money, what about the motivation of power? Right? And there's a lot of power that's outside the domain of money. So I think people are motivated by very, very different things. My grandfather was a priest. He was motivated by something very, very different, right? So
hey, look, I'm a philosopher.
You're motivated by very different things. So I guess I think in terms of what motivates people, the wonderful thing about free people is they're motivated by very, very different things. And I can assure you, if I was motivated by money, I'd be doing something different with my life as well. So.
Well, let me just say one thing about that and then thank our wonderful guests for being with us. I actually think we could have, and I think maybe this is where you were going, Professor, we could have a system in which we had a more equal distribution of income through a more progressive income tax system. And in doing that, we probably could at the same time deregulate a number of functions of government. Part of the problem we have with the regulation is that what we're trying to do, in a strange kind of way, is redistribute resources through regulation. And we do it in a very untransparent way. If we were very clear about what redistribution we thought was appropriate, we might be able to do away with some of the regulations. Because either you couldn't, you could earn it, but it's going to be taxed, much of it will be taxed away, or because we're making it very clear what we want to see as the final distribution when all of this is done. Well, I want to thank my dear Jim and I probably disagree on a number of things, but I think you also saw we actually agreed on a significant number of things. I worry that so much of our political discourse over the last year or two, certainly since the election of Obama and the reaction to him, has been mostly smoke, not a lot of light. I think tonight, particularly because of my colleague here, we have a lot of light, and I want to thank him for a marvelous presentation for our open classroom.